to Community Economic Development. Here at the partnership, my role is to encourage more community action agencies to take on economic development and housing projects. And today is one of our webinars on different aspects of community economic development. Please note that there will be some sessions on CED at the upcoming Management and Leadership Training Conference in Houston in January, and including a couple of speakers who will be talking about the recent OCS grant. So I hope to see some of you there. Today we'll be hearing from Jen Brandwine, who's a leading expert on the OCS CED grant program. She writes these proposals as a profession. She's an expert who's been doing this for many years. Today she's going to be sharing with you some of her insights on how to write a successful application. And with that, I will turn it over to Jen.
Thank you, Kevin. I'm very happy to be here today. A few things to note before we start. I wanted to point out I am not speaking on behalf of OCS in any way. As Kevin said, I am a consultant with considerable experience in writing successful OCS applications, and this presentation presents my views and information from the 2017 OCS announcement. Second, this presentation is not meant to be all-encompassing on how to write a competitive OCS application, but I'm hoping it does give you a sense of what's involved in the application, and more importantly, that it will help you understand what's involved in developing a viable project, which is the critical first step in the process. And finally, while OCS refers to the agency and CED refers to the grant program, OCS and CED are often used interchangeably for this grant program. So, for some basic information to start, OCS CED projects are designed to address the economic needs of low-income individuals and families through job creation projects that will help low-income individuals achieve self-sufficiency, improve low-income communities, and are ready to be implemented upon award. There is such a range of projects, some of which make physical improvements to distressed neighborhoods when they develop vacant, blighted properties for tenant businesses that then create the new jobs. Some projects, such as grocery stores or child care businesses, provide needed services to residents. But all projects are community-driven and address local needs in addition to the jobs being created. And for OCS, job creation refers to full-time, full-year permanent positions created as a direct result of using CED funds for business creation or business expansion. At least 75% of the positions created are to be filled by low-income individuals, which OCS defines as 125% of HHS poverty guidelines or TANF recipients. Part-time and seasonal jobs do not count. Eligible applicants are qualified community development corporations, which is demonstrated by being a private nonprofit with 501c3 status and having an Articles of Incorporation or bylaws demonstrating that your principal purpose is planning, developing, or managing low-income housing or community development projects, and being governed by a board of directors consisting of residents of the community, business, and civic leaders. Grants of up to $800,000 are based on the number of full-time, full-year permanent positions created at a cost per job of $20,000 for non-construction projects and $25,000 for construction projects. And the chart below provides two examples. The first shows the minimum number of jobs that would need to be created in order to apply for the maximum grant. And the second shows the maximum grant you can apply for if the project proposed to create 20 full-time jobs. You'll note that the project periods differ, with a 3-year period for non-construction and 5-year period for construction projects. Also, OCS wants to see that the jobs will all be created at least 1 year before the end of the project period and sustained during the project period and at least 1 year beyond that. So this is very important and needs to be considered in your planning and how you present your project schedule. So with all the jobs needing to be created by years 2 or 4, you can see why it's so important that projects have everything in place and are ready to be implemented as soon as grants are awarded. The feasibility of the proposed job creation needs to be aligned throughout the application. with the readiness and market demand of the business, the financial projections of the business creating the jobs, and the implementation schedule. If it's a non-construction project that's establishing a new business, you're going to have to demonstrate the reasonableness of how quickly revenues will be generated to support all the jobs in the first 2 years. And if you're doing a construction project, depending on how long the construction period is, the tenant creating the jobs may also have to ramp up pretty quickly in order to show all the jobs can reasonably be created by the end of year 4 of the 5-year project period. So based on last year's announcement, the current due date for the next round is April 27th, but that date may change. Last year's application was due in July, but 2 years before that, they were due in April. But no matter when it comes out, awards will be made right around September 30th, and that would be the start date of the project period. So the first step in preparing a competitive OCS application is making sure you have a viable project. So one of the first questions is, what is the project? It's either going to be, obviously, a business expansion or you're going to establish a new business. And it's either going to be a non-construction project or a construction project, which would be considered construction if there's over $250,000 in construction or renovation costs, or if it's 25% of the project cost. So if the project is expanding an existing business, then the follow-up question is, what is the expansion based on? You're going to need to demonstrate how revenue will increase by a large enough margin to support the new jobs being created. And if it's a new business being established, then you want to know whether there's been a market and financial analysis, whether customers are already lined up. It's always harder to demonstrate the project's readiness and feasibility for a business that's not yet in the marketplace. And if construction is involved, then site control and financing becomes extra important. And while it's certainly allowable to have more than one business partner creating the jobs, this presentation is based on having one business creating the jobs. If you're having 2 or 3 businesses creating the jobs, it will be double and triple the amount of information gathering and documentation that all needs to fit into one application. Whereas with one business, you have more room in the application to provide all the details you need to demonstrate the project's viability and readiness. The second question is, where is the project located? It has to be in a low-income area, and that would be based on whether the unemployment and the poverty is either equal to or greater than the state or the national rates. And you would be using recent data, which is considered recent if it's within the past 5 years. All projects need to show proof of site control as part of the application, as it shows readiness to implement and complete the project within the project period. So if you're doing a construction project, you want to show both that the applicant has control of the site and that the business tenant has agreed to occupy the space. Otherwise, you want to show that the business creating the jobs has control of their space, either by owning it themselves or by leasing the space. And if it's a lease, you always want to check the duration to make sure it doesn't expire during the project period or even 1 year after the end of the project period, since, again, OCS wants to see everything's in place to create and sustain the jobs. Next thing is the hardest part of the OCS application is showing you have all of your non-CED funding committed at the time you submit your application. So if it's clear you need more funds than the amount of the grant you're applying for, then you're not ready to apply. If you do have all of your funding, then you want to make sure it's documented with strong written commitments. You can't state that the organization is fundraising for a specific amount of funds that will be allocated to the project. If the funds haven't been raised yet, then it's not going to be a strong commitment. And if the organization is committing their own funds to the project, then you'll want to show the availability of those funds in your financial statements. Again, the amount of the grant you can apply for is directly related to the jobs being created by year 2 of a non-construction project and by year 4 of a construction project. And you obviously want to know what types of jobs are going to be created and what are the skills and what are the job requirements. So you need to show it's reasonable that 75% of the jobs being created can be filled by low-income individuals. And if the jobs are more skilled than typical entry-level positions, you might want to look at your workforce development, recruitment partners, and see if they can address the skills gap. And finally, what is the grant going to be used for? When do you need the grant funds to use, and who is going to be spending the funds? So grantees cannot allocate funds to their project partner without either a loan or equity investment. So we'll be discussing those later in the presentation, but figuring out how the grant will be structured needs to be considered early on in your planning. Typically, non-construction projects use the majority of the grant as a loan to the business that's creating the jobs. So for that type of project, you want to make sure the business has the capacity to repay the loan and has available collateral to make the loan. Grants can also be used as an equity investment into the business in return for an ownership interest, but those are less common. For construction projects on property the grantee owns, the grant funds are typically used as either a loan or equity investment to the grantee's subsidiary that was established to acquire and develop the property. Otherwise, if a grantee uses the grant funds directly on construction, you'll need to file a notice of federal interest, and the federal government will have an ongoing interest in the property forever. Whereas when you use the grant as a loan or equity investment, it's intangible property instead of real property, which means you don't have to file a notice of federal interest, and the amount of time reversionary interest applies is limited to 12 years after the end of the project period instead of forever. So again, I'm sure that was confusing for some of you, but the most important takeaway is that you want to be sure the project costs you plan on being covered by CED funds are eligible costs and structured appropriately. And if your organization is planning on doing a construction project and doesn't have this experience or doesn't have experience with loans or equity investments, then you should connect with organizations that do have that experience. So once you have a viable project in terms of location, site control, an identified business, job creation, and financing, then you want to dig deeper into the details. So a competitive CED project is going to demonstrate how the types of jobs being created are quality jobs that can help low-income individuals achieve self-sufficiency. So what are the starting wages, and how do they compare to the wages that individuals need to earn in order to be self-sufficient in your area? What are the specific fringe benefits? Is there paid leave? In the last announcement, OCS asked applicants to provide evidence of paid leave policies in their application. So the focus is definitely more and more on the quality of the jobs. Again, will jobs provide time for participants to participate in any other services that are designed to help them be successful? Is your participating business willing to commit to creating quality jobs and working with you and your recruitment partners to fill 75% of the jobs with low-income individuals, and ongoing reporting of the jobs created for the entire 3-year or 5-year grant period, which can be a big ask. Information to demonstrate viability of the industry in the specific business. So you'll need to be able to describe the anticipated market, the customers, the competition. You'll need to show that there's a clear demand for the product and that the project is well positioned to meet the demand. So this is going to look totally different for each project, whether it's a supermarket project or manufacturing expansion or a daycare business. But in all cases, you need to present specific information to show there's a sufficient market for the business to achieve and sustain the level and quality of job creation that's being proposed. You don't want to invest in a project where there isn't a sufficient market for the business to be successful. And if you're developing a new business or investing in a business or industry that you don't know much about, then you should bring people on with the right expertise and make sure that there's a reasonable likelihood for success, and you want to weigh the financial risks before you decide whether to make that investment. You want to develop your loan and equity terms if that's applicable to your project. But in general, for a loan project, you want to determine whether the business will generate enough revenue not only to support the jobs, but also to repay the loan. And you want to know whether the business has available collateral security for the loan. If the business has other loans, then their level of collateral may be limited. Equity investments, again, are used to acquire an ownership interest in the business. So it could be a stock purchase in a company or paid in capital if the grantee is investing in their own subsidiary to develop the property that they own. Again, if your organization doesn't have experience with loans or equity investments, then you want to find a partner who has this experience. You're also going to need to obtain past and projected financials of the business. The projections should be based on assumptions that are aligned with the implementation schedule and the job creation plan. The projection should incorporate OCS debt service if you're making a loan to the business, and it should show that it generates sufficient revenue to create and sustain the new jobs, that there's a positive income being generated, and is overall financially feasible. So if you're doing a development project where the grantee is essentially the landlord, then you're going to want to include not only the financials of the business or the tenant creating the jobs, but also the projected financials of the building that shows that the tenant revenues are sufficient to cover the building expenditures and debt service. If you're establishing a new business, then you'll need to be very clear on how the business is set up to generate revenues right away and ramp up fast enough to create all the jobs in the project schedule. With existing businesses that are expanding, you at least have a starting point with their past financials, but you still want to make sure that the change occurring that is allowing them to expand and create the jobs are also appropriately reflected in the projections as compared to their past financials. Detailed costs. So part of demonstrating your readiness to implement the project is knowing how much it's going to cost. So if you don't provide line item budget details, it's hard to know how you arrived at the cost, and it makes it harder to demonstrate that you've done your due diligence and are really ready to go. If you're doing a construction project, you need estimates from a contractor. Otherwise, getting solid commitments for the non-CED funds is going to be challenging. And if you're using the funds to establish a new business, then make sure there's enough startup capital in the budget to cover all the costs before enough revenue is generated. So program income cannot be used as a source of funds to cover implementation costs. So, you know, that's always a big issue that comes up. You need to show that you have enough startup capital to start the business and cover the expenses before you have enough revenue being generated, and allow enough time in that, allow wiggle room for that. Strong financial commitment letters. So you're going to need that for all sources of funds other than the OCS grant, and that needs to be in your application when you submit it. So depending on the funder and the size of the construction project, getting strong commitment documentation for construction projects prior to the financial closing of the project can be a challenge. You always want to review the language of your commitments early and give the funder extra time to strengthen the language if necessary, if you can convince them to do so. But if the documents say clearly this is not a commitment, then it's not going to pass muster in your application. You need to be able to demonstrate that you have sufficient capacity and expertise to implement and manage the project, or that you have a more experienced partner that's on board with you that's going to help. And if you're using the funds as a loan or equity and have never done that before, or if you haven't successfully implemented job creation projects that are similar in size or scope to the one you're proposing, then you really should have an experienced partner that has this experience. Community support, you always want to keep the community and public officials informed with what you're planning, particularly for any development projects. And you want to make sure there's no opposition that could negatively impact the implementation. You also want to make sure your board is informed and supportive of the project and how it's structured, particularly if this involves setting up a subsidiary to acquire or develop property. So these are agreements that you would have with project partners that are spending the CED funds and creating the jobs. So there are other agreements that we'll get to later, but this is specifically for the partners that are spending the funds and creating the jobs. So there's a partnership agreement, either a loan or equity investment agreement, unless you're using the funds directly yourself as the applicant. And there would also be a signed commitment from the participating business creating the job. So some projects have all three of these combined into one agreement with one participating business partner that's both spending the CED grant via a loan or equity investment and creating the jobs directly. Other times when the applicant is using the funds as loan or equity to its subsidiary to help develop property it owns to help attract the business tenant creating the jobs, the applicant would have one partnership in loan or equity investment agreement with its subsidiary, and then it would have a separate signed commitment from the business that's actually creating the jobs directly. And that could be part of the lease agreement with the tenant, especially because you would have control over that if you're the one developing the property. So the first agreement, again, is between the applicant and the partner spending the CED funds. So you would basically describe the roles and relationships of each of you, and this language is minimum language. This is literally lifted out of the last year's announcement. But basically, the partner receiving the funds is on the hook. You know, they know that they need to create the jobs, and that at least 75% of the jobs need to be filled by individuals with low income, that they're going to be recruited and determined as eligible, all of these things. Again, they're going to document expenditures of grant funds and that those are going to be appropriate expenditures. They'll agree to federal monitoring, and last but not least, this is always a sticking point that people don't always understand, but they'll need to, the number of jobs being created is different than the number of individuals hired. So they will need to track both of them, but really it's the positions created that is the important piece in all of this tracking. So below is language from the program announcement on what should be included in loan and equity agreements. That would be part of the application. And if you're making a loan, you would also have other loan documents available to be executed if you're awarded the OCS funds. So again, if you don't have experience with loans or equity investments, you want to connect with other organizations that have this experience, see what agreements they use, that sort of thing. But for loan agreement, they do have on here business development plan in the agreement. I honestly think that was put in there when grantees set up a loan fund and they're making multiple loans. I think that there's probably not a lot of information in the narrative on what the business development plan is, so I think that's why OCS might have put that in there. But when you're focusing on one business throughout the entire proposal, You don't need to include a whole business development plan in your loan agreement, but you should describe what the project is. The interest rate would be at or below market rate in your area for this type of loan, whichever loan that you're doing. The loan term and repayment schedule is flexible. You want to make sure the terms are doable based on the capacity of the business. So maybe a new company needs a 6-month interest-only period on the loan before they can begin principal payments, or maybe the loan term is longer to reduce the amount of principal to make it affordable for the business. Balloon loans are only allowed if they're paid in full before the end of the project period, but those are risky loans, and I don't recommend them. I never recommend balloon loans. Collateral security, you want to find out what assets of the business can be used as collateral on the loan. So do they have equipment or receivables or a mortgage on the property, or would you just do a blanket lien on all of their assets? Again, if the business has other loans, then available collateral may be limited. So it's important to figure this stuff out in the beginning of the process. The other information is self-explanatory. So for equity investments, the language that's provided by OCS is really geared to equity stock investments. So if you're using the grant as equity into an entity that's totally unrelated to you, then you should get more expertise on how to devise an agreement that defines your ownership stake in the company. But if you're using the grant as an equity investment into your subsidiary to develop a building you own, then the type of equity would be considered paid in capital, which doesn't really relate to the cost or number of shares of stock, but it could result in a taxable event. So you want to consult with your accountant when you're developing these. You also want to include language on compliance concerning intangible property in these agreements. And in general, you want to make sure you have a clear understanding on all of the regulations pertaining to the OCS CED grant program, which are all referred to in the program announcements. So this language, this signed commitment from participating business, creating the jobs, this was new in the last announcement. But basically, however the project is structured, each participating business that's creating the jobs directly would need to provide a signed commitment agreeing to create full-time, full-year positions that provide wages that will allow individuals with low income to achieve self-sufficiency through competitive wages, paid leave, fringe benefits, opportunities for career growth, and/or predictable and flexible scheduling practices. And the ability of the business to do so will also need to be demonstrated through its projected financial statements and accompanying detailed assumptions. So this, not all companies may be able to agree to this, but whatever pieces of it they can agree to would need to be in a separate agreement. And again, this can be a standalone agreement. It can be part of the loan document. It can be in your lease agreement with them if you're developing space you own, but it would need to be in there. So this is last year's criteria and maximum points per section, and I wanted to provide it just to give you an overview of the sections that are covered in the announcement. And I also wanted to point out a few things where, first of all, where you see the highest points are awarded are under project viability, project implementation, and budget justification, which should really reinforce the importance of having a viable project that's ready to go and being able to demonstrate its viability by the level of details and accompanying documentation that's provided in the application. And second, I know I've pressed upon this before, but if you don't have all of your financing to implement the project, or if any of your financial commitment documentation is weak, you're going to get dinged for points in multiple sections. You'll get dinged in project viability, project implementation, financial strategies, the budget section, and project integration. And that's going to make it very difficult, if not impossible, to score high enough, even if you're eligible for bonus points. And as for the bonus points, they do seem to slightly change from year to year. So just keep that in mind. But whatever the bonus points end up being, the ones that can be incorporated into your project, the ones that relate to you or that you can make part of your project, it should be part of the business plan and, you know, the implementation plan. And it shouldn't just be mentioned here in the bonus point section. So this link below will bring you to last year's announcement and other information for prospective grantees. Again, there will likely be some changes to last year's announcement, but enough of it will be the same, and it can definitely be used as a guide to help you plan your project and your application. So here I wanted to just give you an overview of the page limitations. So especially if it's a construction project and if more than one business is creating the jobs. You only have 75 pages double-spaced for the project description, and it doesn't leave a lot of room to fully address all of the criteria. The appendices, 125 pages, includes the table of contents, so you're already down to 124. So it can be very tough for a construction project, especially if it has lots of different funding sources going into it, or if you're doing more than one business, it can be tough. So first, for the proof of legal status, proof of nonprofit, this is where you're going to demonstrate that you're an eligible CDC. You're going to have your articles or bylaws showing your principal purpose, a descriptive list of the board of directors so they can see what the makeup of your board is, and proof of your 501c3. For market research and data, that's really there for if you can't fit everything into the narrative. You have another place to put it. I usually don't include anything there, mainly because I have other documentation that needs to fit. I usually have all my market data in the narrative. Evidence of site control. So again, assuming one business is creating the jobs, you'd either have a property deed and or a lease agreement for the business that's creating the jobs. If the grantee is the developer or landlord, then the lease agreement, which can include the signed commitment from the participating business, you would have that. You would have the you would show that you own the property, and you would also show that you have leased that the business has agreed to lease the property. But if more than one business is creating the jobs, you're going to have additional site control documents. And for financial documentation, again, assuming one business is creating the jobs, you're going to have sources and uses of funds. You're going to have projected financial statements for the business creating the jobs with accompanying detailed assumptions. And if this is a construction project and you're the developer, then you'd also include the projected financial statements of the development itself to show the feasibility of tenant revenues covering expenses. But again, if more than one business is creating the jobs, you're going to have additional financial documentation here. So for third-party agreements, you're going to have all your financial commitment documentation for all your non-CED funds. Then, depending on how the project is structured, you're either going to have one agreement that would be the project partner agreement with a loan equity investment agreement with the signed commitment from the participating business, or if you're not if you're using the funds directly somehow and you don't have a loan or equity, then you'd have a project partner agreement with a signed commitment from the participating. Oh, no, you wouldn't. We'd have to figure out how you're going to do that project partner agreement if you're using the funds directly. But if you're using the grant to develop the building you own to accommodate the business or tenant that's creating the jobs, then you'd have two documents. You'd have one project partner and loan equity investment agreement, and then you'd have a separate signed commitment from the participating business, unless that's already part of the lease agreement with the tenant. Then you would have your recruitment and public agency agreements. Again, this is just to show that you've identified organizations in your area that provide appropriate services to help low-income individuals get prepared for employment. And if you have specific workforce development entities in your area that are providing any kind of skilled training, you definitely would want an agreement with them, and this is where it would be. If the bonus points stay the same and there's financial literacy services in there, then you would definitely want to have a financial literacy services agreement in there with the entity that's providing those services. If you're providing those services, then, you know, you can even have that. I would have it in here somewhere. You can put it as other supporting documentation or something, but I would highlight it if you're providing those services. Again, the rest is fairly self-explanatory. You're going to have resumes, which are limited to 2 pages each, by the way. You're going to have your letters of support. The audited financial statements is for the applicant and the project partner that is spending the OCS funds. And other supporting documentation, you're going to have a board resolution in there that shows your board approves of this project. Again, you're going to have evidence of paid leave policies of the business that's creating the jobs. You're going to have written job descriptions. You know, you can put other stuff in there, but those are required documents. So this is where they would go. So again, it's a lot of documentation and not a lot of space to put it, depending on how your project is structured, but especially if you're dealing with more than one business. So in closing, I just can't stress enough to really go through the full announcement page by page and not just the criteria pages, because there's a lot of information packed in there, and even though it's not always organized very effectively, everything is in the announcement. Review the webinar again, especially the initial questions on the 3rd slide to see whether you have a viable project. And if your project involves any activities that you don't have experience with, then you really want to connect with more experienced partners and incorporate that expertise into both your planning and the implementation. And if it seems like you have a viable project, then it's never too soon to start preparing your application. The process of collecting information from the business, developing a detailed budget, getting strong financial commitment documentation, it always takes more time than you think. So, and that does conclude the body of it. I'm hoping that there are a lot of questions, since I always go through this more quickly than I expect. So we do have a lot of time for questions.
And remember to submit the questions through the chat feature on your screen. Okay, let's see anything yet. We'll give it another minute or so, but I hope everybody's gotten a lot out of this. There's a lot of information that's packed into this. So I want to thank her on behalf of the partnership for her willingness to do this. As I mentioned in the beginning, she's got a lot of years of experience, so these are some insights that are quite valuable. You aren't going to get these just from reading the note itself.
Right.
Okay, we do have a question here. What is a non-construction project, and can you give an example of this?
A non-construction project? Sure. So let's say you want to make a loan to a business. Let's say the business needs a certain type of equipment and working capital to support a new contract that they're going to have. You know, you would basically be making a loan to a business that's going to expand, but it doesn't involve any kind of physical change to their building or constructing a new building or anything like that. They just need working capital to ramp up for a new contract. That would be one example. Let me try to think here. I have another. Let's see.
Let me just add one example. This is from this year's grantees, and they're a member of ours, which is why I'm familiar with it. It was Long Island County Community Action, and they needed the money to hire a deconstruction crew, and they will then go to buildings that need to be knocked down and deconstruct them, take the reusable materials from that, and then resell those items in a store that they have. So they're not actually constructing, in fact, they're doing the opposite. So it's really for working capital for hiring people.
Mm-hmm. Right.
Okay, that person said thanks, that's helpful. We're going to see if we get any more questions here. This is your chance to ask the expert about this, so don't be shy. Okay, looks like we have one that's in the Q&A box. I work with a tribe, and they have a community center that is half built. However, they lost the funding source. So the project has stalled. They do not have to finish the community center. Could this be an eligible project for CED funds?
Okay, so this is a great question. So literally, we would go back to slide 3 for this one. Whoops. So what I would ask generally for this is, what are the jobs that are going to be created as a result of the community center? So that would be one question to ask. And again, you want to make sure these are full-time, full-year positions, and the number of positions created would correlate with the amount of grant that you can apply for. So how much funding is needed, and does that correlate to the number of jobs that are going to be created? And that 75% of those jobs can be filled by low-income individuals. Then I'd also ask, how, would the applicant, so you want to make sure the tribe is an eligible applicant. So that would be one point. You want to make sure the tribe has a Community Development Corporation arm of the tribe. And you'd want to know if they're developing the building themselves, which is allowable. It's just you're going to have reversionary, you're going to have to file a notice of federal interest, and you're going to have reversionary interest apply to that community center building forever. So if they're not interested in structuring it that way, then you want to see if the tribe has another subsidiary that's doing the development, and then can the funds then be used as equity or loan to that subsidiary to do the development. And you'd also want to talk about timing. So again, no matter when the applications are due, the funds won't be available. Well, the funds won't be awarded until September 30th, and even after that, it usually takes another several weeks before the awardee can actually access the funds. So you want to see if that timing will fit. So it could work. You just have a lot of questions to find out about.
Okay, that's all the questions that I see here. Well, I think that's it. As I mentioned at the outset, I have a list of who signed up with their email, so I will send an email with a link to the recording, so you can listen to this again if you'd like to, and also a copy of the PDF of the PowerPoint, so you can take a look at those at your leisure as well. And I hope that we see some of you succeed in getting some CED funds from OCS in next year's round. So we'd like to see more community action agencies take advantage of this program. There's a couple that got it this year, but we'd like to see more. So thanks to everybody for participating in today's call, and thanks again to our speaker, Jen Brandwine. That's it for today.
Thank you. Thank you.